Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, second part there for the 1st of January 2024. Happy New Year. Not a crazy amount of news, as you can imagine, being the 1st of January, concerning military aid and geopolitical stuff, but I am going to focus a little bit on a particular article concerning France that I think is incredibly important. Anyway, on aid, let's go to, and military equipment. Let's turn to first this news. So it appears Ukraine is using Indian-produced 155mm shells. I see some reports saying these are South African, but I believe they are of Indian origin, which is hilarious considering BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and that kind of coalition of nations. Well, this comes from a Crab, AHS Crab. So this is the Polish, South Korean self-propelled howitzer. Some footage of a loader inside whacking in those shells, and someone's like, "Oh, what shells are they?" And it looks like they are Indian shells. So who knows how they've got to Ukraine? It's fairly evident that nations like the UK have been going around the world where we haven't got too much equipment ourselves. We go around the world and buy stuff of other people and get that to Ukraine. It could be that it has got there for that reason. Right, this is going majorly viral at the moment on the socials, this footage, and this has been released by the Ukrainians. What is it? Well, this is a development that I think is fairly significant. Now, the Ukrainian SBU has released a video of one of their unmanned surface vehicles, or sea drones, naval drones. It shows a spectacular new development. Apparently, Ukrainian USVs are now capable of firing missiles. The video shows an attack against the Russian Navy vessels in the port of Russian-occupied Sevastopol. So I don't know where this is from, but they've released this. This is an attack on ships in or near Sevastopol. This is a Sea Baby drone, and as you can see, there are rockets firing off into the distance, and there's another drone to its left, and this is on top of the drone that we are looking from. There are rockets being fired into the distance. Now, these are unguided missiles, so these are basically like Grad rocket launchers that we've seen on top of, say, SUVs where they've loaded sort of technicals with 6 or 3 tubes launching these missiles. Well, it looks like Sea Babies have that capability now. I don't know how effective these will be. I don't know how easy it will be to target something in the distance and hit it. Probably easier than doing on land, but I don't know whether there's any sort of recall to the boats or to these drones, and how these missiles are aimed. Nonetheless, the next stage of this evolution, I assume, would be guided missiles. So having USVs, shooting around the Black Sea, firing guided missiles at ships would be incredible. So this is doing the rounds. Lots of people talking about this. And again, this is how Ukraine can eke out success, by having that competitive advantage in terms of technology. Is something Zaluzhny was talking about in his piece in The Economist. The Ukrainians need technological breakthroughs and advantages over the Russians. This is one example where they can get that. And interesting about this advantage is that if the Russians were to go toe to toe with the Ukrainians here, it's kind of meaningless because Ukrainians don't have naval vessels to fire at. So, as the Ukrainians evolve their technological capabilities in terms of maritime drones, if the Russians keep up with that, they can't really use them, whereas the Ukrainians can. So it's not like these capabilities evolving with aerial drones, where the Russians can then use that capability. They can catch up with the Ukrainian technological breakthrough and use those drones on the Ukrainians, like we have seen in terms of that arms race with aerial drones. That arms race in maritime drones, even if the Russians do really well with their technology, will have negligible effect because the Ukrainians just don't have a navy to use them on. They can only really use them on maritime export, grain export vessels, international vessels, and of course that opens up a whole can of worms. Right, moving on. In terms of explaining the evolution of the maritime drone project, there's an article in Ukrainska Pravda, I think, called "Water Drones, Elon Musk and High Precision Missiles: How Ukraine Recaptured the Black Sea." This is a long and detailed article about what the Ukrainians have done over time. Yes, it does go through Elon Musk, turning off Starlink, and that being a real problem for particularly one of their operations, and it gives a little bit of detail about that. So if you love Elon Musk, well, you have to take that one to the team. But anyway, really good article about the evolution of activities in the Black Sea over time. And I'm not going to go into it now, but I'll try and remember to link this in the description below, and you can get a Google Translate as it goes. And now it talks about how the Ukrainians have struck all these different vessels with these drones, and then moved the Russian Black Sea fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, and also re-established a grain route down the edge of the Black Sea, so on and so forth. Really good article, lots of interesting info in there. Good stuff. Right, moving on. Magyar has come up with a big old montage and video talking about sort of where they're at the moment, and it's worth looking at. There's a translation. I can't get you the script for the translation, but Thierry has sent me, I don't know whether it's a translation he has created himself with Google, but he says, nice info in Ukrainian from Robert Magyar about anti-drone warfare. Here's a Google Translate. Today, the 1,000th Worm FPV drone, the Russian FPV drone, was destroyed since the beginning of the Kulibin anti-FPV project. So he's got this anti-counter drone project with his own drones that he is obviously prosecuting, and I think that might involve electronic warfare equipment too. So we felt that way of struggle on the Donetsk front line of the Uruzhany district in September 2023. Since then, the recycling process has improved. I don't know if these are the exact words that I think Google Translate has thrown a few curveballs here. The total, so the recycling process, I think that means the kind of success percentages of taking down Russian FPV drones. Anyway, total quantity and the average value of the recovery of detective PEP is 1,325 pieces, and destroyed electronic warfare 1,006 pieces. Of the FPV drones was 75.9%. So trying to translate the Google Translate there, I think they are basically, at that time, they were taking down 75.9, so almost 76% of Russian drones that they were detecting, 1,325 pieces. So during the stay in the southern LBZ, so that is the Krinky area, only in the vicinity of Krinky at the current moment, the combined group detected 1,041 drones and destroyed 799 enemy drones. So that is a percentage of 76.7%. So they're moving up towards 78% now. The project is gaining momentum by the forces and means of the consolidated group of REB and REP. It's basically the people who are doing it. That is the TLDR, the takeaway conclusion of this is that Magyar and his crew have a project and a concerted effort to take down Russian FPV drones and possibly pieces of electronic warfare equipment. And as they detect them, they are taking down about 77% of that stuff at the moment in the Krinky area. And that is incredibly important. So they are degrading the Russian drone capabilities there. With some kind of detection and elimination project. Good stuff. Thanks to Thierry for sending that to me. As we know, the Germans have delivered another 2 AMPS by Hensoldt to Ukraine. There are now 4 in total. So AMPS, remember, I told you was a target warning or target acquisition. So when helicopters or indeed fixed-wing airframes have an aerial threat coming towards them, a missile of some variety, it can detect the missile, and it can also, depending on how it's configured, send off some things like chaff or flares, and it can also send off laser to misdirect the missiles depending on what kind of system is set up exactly. But these AMPS systems are kind of plug and play systems, I think, that you can load onto helicopters or fixed wing aircraft, and you can either have them separate in like the back of the helicopter, or you can have it integrated into your sort of console and whatnot at the front. Anyway, they've now got 4 of these airborne missile protection systems. On the image below, we can see a Ukrainian Mi-17 with Hensoldt sensors, MLDSAN AAR-60 Block 2, which are part of the AMPS. The MILDS Block 2 is a passive, true imaging sensor device optimized to detect the radiation signature of the UV solar blind spectral band that is emitted from an approaching hostile missile exhaust plume. So it detects, rather than detecting the missile itself, it detects the exhaust plume from the missile and does that evidently really quickly, quick enough to do something about it before the missile hits. It is designed to be the successor of the famous MILDS-AN AAR-60, providing enhanced sensitivity in addition applications like HFI, whatever all that means. So this detects incoming missile threats and indicates the direction of arrival at maximum warning time. The inherently high spatial resolution of this system, combined with advanced temporal processing, enables a very high declaration rate while virtually eliminating false alarms. It comprises 4 to 6 self-contained detectors that provide high resolution and high sensitivity without extra cooling. Each sensor provides fully processed signals. In addition, no central processing unit is required. Make of that what you will, but this is all good news that they've got 4 of these on helicopters, which you would assume would allow those helicopters to survive from attacks from things like man-pads. So good stuff, and obviously the more of those they can get hold of, the better the Ukrainian airframes will be, or the better position they'll be in. Right, now moving on to geopolitical stuff. On January the 1st, so today, the G7 countries' ban on the import of non-industrial natural diamonds, artificial diamonds and jewellery containing diamonds into EU countries from Russia came into force. Good news. Now, this is the article from the Washington Post on France that I'm going to delve into. The Kremlin's manoeuvring and ties to a number of far-right parties across Europe, including in France, are causing concern among European officials ahead of the European Parliament elections in June. So, there's a really good article in the Washington Post. I know, WAPO and NYT have come under a lot of criticism recently for some of their pro-appeasement rhetoric and articles, but this is a good one in the Washington Post. Russia is working to subvert French support for Ukraine, documents show. There's quite a lot of good information in here. So just dipping into some of it, Russia has been increasing its efforts to undermine French support for Kiev, a hidden propaganda front in Western Europe that is part of the war against Ukraine, according to Kremlin documents and interviews with European security officials and far-right political figures. The manoeuvring and Kremlin connections with a host of far-right parties across Europe, and I've talked about this a lot before myself, including in France, are worrying some European officials ahead of the European Parliament elections in June. Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, warned at the conference this month that those elections could be, quote, as dangerous as the American ones, driven by, quote, fear in response to growing inequality and security threats. Quote, Europe is in danger, he said. The Kremlin documents obtained by European Security Service and reviewed by the Washington Post showed that Sergei Kiriyenko, the first deputy chief of staff in President Putin's administration, I say dictator Putin's administration, has tasked Kremlin political strategists with promoting political discord in France through social media and French political figures, opinion leaders and activists. Those figures were not identified by name in the documents seen by the Post. Moscow's goal is to undermine support for Ukraine and weaken NATO resolve, the documents show. The effort parallels similar interference in Germany, where the Kremlin has attempted to marry the far right and far left in an anti-war alliance, a Post previously reported. The talking points to be amplified by the Kremlin strategists included arguing that Western sanctions against Russia have damaged the French economy through a decline in trade, leaving the country at risk of falling into, quote, the deepest social and economic crisis of recent years, as well as asserting the supply of arms to Ukraine has left France without the weapons to defend itself. So classic kind of narrative positioning here that the Russians are either producing or amplifying. Several weekly dashboard presentations to Kremlin officials in 2022 showed that Moscow thought France was vulnerable to political turmoil. Citing opinion polls, the strategist noted that 30% of the French retained a positive view of Russia, the second highest among Western European countries after Italy, while 40% were inclined not to believe reporting on Ukraine by France's own mass media. So remember, I reported this from this article yesterday. I'm now going through it in some detail. Later in 2023, Kiriyenko's Kremlin group ordered the strategist to promote messaging that would increase the number of those in France reluctant to, quote, pay for another country's war. One of the documents shows they were also told to increase, quote, the fear of direct of confrontation with Russia and the start of World War III with Europe's participation, and to boost the number of those who want, quote, dialogue with Russia on the construction of a common European security architecture, end quote. The United States was to be described as using Ukraine as an instrument to weaken Russia's position in Europe, the documents state. They show that the troll farms created by the Kremlin political strategists produced and published social media content and articles critical of Western support for Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky's government. One note written by one of the strategists in June 2023 directed a troll farm employee to create a 200-character comment by a middle-aged French person who considered Europe's support for Ukraine to be, quote, a stupid adventure. The fictional French person was also supposed to argue that support for Ukraine is turning into, quote, inflation and falling living standards. And of course, this is the sort of thing they do not just once, but thousands of times across social media. I've seen it on my threads plenty of times. People claiming to be X and Y nationality, just spouting pro-Russian propaganda that seeks to undermine support for Ukraine and apparently show that there are, this many people from that whatever nation in support of basically Russian ends there. Anyway, to dip back into the article a little later, it says, at the end of June, after Paris erupted into riots, so I don't know if you remember those riots in June of last year, into riots over the police killing of a teenager of Moroccan and Algerian origin, a network of pro-Russian social media accounts became highly active, according to a study conducted by Alto Intelligence, a leading cybersecurity firm that tracks anomalous digital media activity across Europe. So what Russia is so good at doing is taking divisive events or ideas and driving a wedge to widen that chasm and divide populations. So a tiny fraction of profiles, 1.2%, produced 30.6% of all digital media commentary on the riots. Wow. That is, if you're going to take anything away from what I'm telling you about this article, that's what you want to know. A tiny fraction of what is almost certainly troll accounts produce 1/3, like 1% of the voices about these events produce 30% of the media commentary on the riots in this case. Among the most prolific accounts, 24.2% were injecting pro-Russian posts into the commentary. So the one, okay, so 24% of those of that content was pro-Russian. And most of the accounts were aligned to the far-right French politicians such as Eric Zemmour or Le Pen, Alto found. Concerns are also growing that Kremlin could seek to exacerbate mounting tensions over the Israel-Gaza conflict, a senior European security official said, adding that Russia was willing to exploit a wide array of political issues. Exactly. In November, French officials said Moscow's fingerprints were found on an attempt to fan tensions between France's Jewish and Muslim communities, both the biggest in Europe, following Israel's invasion of Gaza. A Moldovan couple was arrested for painting hundreds of Stars of David across the streets of Paris, and French officials said they believe the couple was acting on the instructions of a pro-Russian Moldovan businessman. Again, follow the money, follow the directives through to, oh look, here we have Balkan pro-Russian entities painting Stars of David to divide Muslim and Jewish communities in France, and it's nothing to do with those communities. But then those communities get up in arms. There's discord on the streets of Paris or French communities, and it is being, indirectly but fairly explicitly organized by Russia. it's just like low cost, high effect meddling. Russia doesn't need to go to war. I don't think they needed to go to war in Ukraine. They could, all the money they spent on Ukraine, if they'd spent on troll farms, they would have caused much greater havoc around the world. All that money and all those people, instead of sending them to their deaths, employ them in buildings in St. Petersburg and Moscow and wherever, Brachia, wherever, to just spread discord around the world, and they would have got a far greater return on investment. When France's state digital watchdog detected more than 1,000 bots amplifying photos of those Stars of David, French authorities called the effort, quote, a new operation of Russian digital interference against France and part of, quote, an opportunistic and irresponsible strategy aimed at exploiting international crises to sow confusion and create tensions in France and Europe. My opinion is that France and every nation should be talking about this at the top of every news program. Almost like a public announcement warning. Say, warning, if you see something like this on social media today, there is a very large chance it is being put there by Russia. Warning to anyone watching this news program. And there should be public service posters up around, metro stations saying, if you see stuff like this on social media, just remember there's a very high probability chance that will be put there by Russia. Just so you are walking around, you're seeing the idea that what you may be seeing and hearing is coming from a nefarious activity from international state actors. We've got to fight back in this disinformation war with France. Opportunistic and irresponsible strategy aimed at exploiting international crises to sow confusion and create tensions in France and Europe. That is so huge. Anyway, after a bit later in the article, after a 6-month inquiry this year into foreign interference in the French political process, France's parliament focused in on the Kremlin declaring in its final report, quote, Russia is conducting a long-term disinformation campaign in our country. I mean, there you go. That seeks, quote, to defend and promote Russian interests and to polarize our democratic society. And, yes, I'm talking about France, but any European country, this is happening to some degree, to differing levels. And indeed, and we'll find out in a little second, we've heard that the White House announced that this is happening big time in Latin America. Come back to that in a sec. It also highlighted the role of Le Pen. So this is Marine Le Pen, who is the daughter of the previous ruler or leader of the Front National, so now called National Rally. They've kind of tried to become more attractive to normal French people. So they moved this kind of far-right rhetoric that was really divisive previously, and they've made it become more and more palatable over time, changing names, diluting it a little bit, but it's still basically National Front. But actually they've gained hugely in popularity, especially given the situation with immigration into France, and as you've seen, the largest, say, Muslim population in Europe resides there. You've got the Maghrebin, the kind of North African areas, formerly of the French kind of empire, have huge communities, particularly in places like Toulouse and not Toulouse, other nations, other cities in the south, Nice and Lyon and places. So you have these brooding issues that have been existing for a long time but have been capitalized upon by what is now the National Rally. So it's also highlighted the role of Le Pen's National Rally, finding that the party, quote, maintains many privileged links with the Kremlin and had effectively acted as, quote, a communication channel for its views, although they strongly deny that. The inquiry raised questions about whether National Rally, formerly called the National Front, had received, quote, material support from Russia in return for backing its positions, including through 2 loans organized by Schaffhauser. So this is a person that the article goes on to talk about in some depth, and they're Schaffhauser's links to Russia to finance a party and Le Pen's 2017 presidential campaign. So no one would give them money, no one would give the far right money to do their campaign. So they went and got a bunch of money off Russia, effectively is what happened. So the Le Pen's campaign, 2017 campaign, was basically funded by Russia, by the Kremlin. The first loan for 9.4 million euros in 2014 came directly from a Russian bank, while the second for 8 million euros in 2017 was more mysterious origin via an Abu Dhabi bank, the inquiry said. In other words, Russia. Sensing a change in the political winds after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Le Pen has become quieter on advocating closer ties with Moscow. Tarnished by the 2014 loan from Russia, which is paid back early, National Rally said in September she has limited her comments mostly to the negative impact of sanctions on the French economy. But National Rally has withheld support for Ukraine in several key votes in the French parliament, either abstaining or voting against the measures. The voices in the party and elsewhere on the far right have in recent months become louder on the issue of Ukraine and restoring relations with Moscow. Russia, quote, is not going to drop the links they had with National Rally, said Fiona Hill, a former director for Russia on the staff of President Donald Trump's National Security Council. One of the party's most prominent voices on Russia is Thierry Mariani, a member of the European Parliament who was singled out in the inquiry for his, quote, great ideological and political proximity to the Russian authorities. The report especially noted his leadership of the Association of Franco-Russian Dialogue, a Paris think tank founded by the Russian government, that the inquiry said has long been a hub for promoting Kremlin views. I mean, goodness me, hiding in plain sight. The report also questioned Mariani's frequent visits to Russia and his role in as an election observer, rubber stamping illegal votes held by Moscow-backed separatists in 2018 in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region. The report also noted that he led National Rally delegations to Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula illegally annexed by Russia in 2014. I mean, this is a French bloody political entity. In connection with these visits, but without naming names, Nicolas Lerner, then head of France's domestic intelligence agency, told the inquiry, quote, some elected officials have clearly maintained clandestine relationships with Russian intelligence services. Yeah. In the past few months, Mariani has become increasingly vocal against Western support for Ukraine, telling the European Parliament in October that sanctions against Russia had only created more enemies for the EU. Later in December, he gave an interview to the Russian state news agency TASS, calling Zelensky's policies, quote, state terrorism, and accusing the Ukrainian president of behaving, quote, like a mafioso ready to eliminate those whom he considers a threat to his power. Then, in a post on X, formerly Twitter, he wrote, quote, Europe will be paying for years to reconstruct Ukraine, whereas the United States still make money on the war to restart its economy. So this is overt Russian propaganda, and people like, I mean, feel free to go and find Mariani on Twitter and give him both barrels. Like we need to fight back in this disinformation war. In an interview with the Post, Mariani sought to play down his Russia links. Oh, how convenient. Saying he had merely discovered an affinity for Russia in 1976 when he was 17 and his military school had sent him there to study the language. He is certainly I would say, a Russian agent of some sort, knowingly or not. But he insisted his actions that actions against Russia were leading Europe into an economic catastrophe, and that things would only get worse if Moscow tightened its lock on global commodity prices with the expansion of BRICS, an alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the Kremlin sees as anti-Western, with the addition of Saudi Arabia and Iran early in 2024. Well, actually, Europe, economically speaking, is bouncing back, not as well as the US at the moment, but things are not as bad as Doom says claim. And I've talked about this with regard to the US, is that the stats on the US economy are the best in the world. Like the US is doing better than G7. Many Americans don't want to see that because there's this view, and you get this in a lot of countries, that you almost don't. Political division and partisanship is more important than your own country doing well. So you'd rather say that Biden is crap than admit that your own country is doing quite well. And that's a weird situation, but it's kind of normal. Like, it's as if I would want to slag off Rishi Sunak more than celebrating successes he has had. And I can see that. It happens to all of us. But it's particularly prevalent in the US, where you would rather say you're economically tanking than accept that actually economically, like if you actually look at some of the business reports on Fox News, through gritted teeth they admit the economy is doing well, and it's doing better than any other comparable nation. So we need to sometimes be, I think, a bit more unified behind our own governments, even if they are governments that we otherwise wouldn't agree with, because otherwise it allows these divisions to come in that are amplified by nefarious international state actors like the Kremlin who will come and drive that wedge, and it will divide our countries and make us more partisan because it sows more discord. And as you can see, that's happening here. Anyway, the article goes on to talk about Schaffhauser quite a bit. Worth looking into. Good article there from Washington Post. Anyway, moving on. Zelensky vows to unleash wrath on Russian forces, and this is what he said in his 20-minute New Year's address, saying that they're going to unleash wrath against Russian forces in 2024, saying Ukraine has become stronger as the war moves towards its third year. But he doesn't mention anything about the front line and didn't mention anything about the US Congress impasse. So, keeping it positive and, keeping away from some of those more difficult subjects. And just talking about nefarious impacts of Russian propaganda, someone reached out to me and said, "Hey, Jonathan, I'm from Mexico, but I've been living in London for the past year and a half. I came home for Christmas, so went back to Mexico for Christmas, and I was amazed by the amount of advertising in the streets for Russia Today in Mexico City. I had never seen it before. I thought you'd find it interesting. Holy crap, I do find that interesting and really worrying. And this is exactly what the White House has just been warning about, that there are campaigns afoot in Latin America, Central America, to gain for, there are projects afoot by the Kremlin to gain a presence there and to start trying to control the narrative about Ukraine and against the US. So be warned about that, people from those necks of the wood, but also, nearby in the US, there is also that kind of project afoot in the US through possibly even more clandestine routes, as is the case all over, as I've been explaining to you with regard to France and indeed, the UK. I was talking about that the other day with the guy that's been given a peerage in the House of Lords. He was one of these people who had a think tank group, a Russian think tank group in the UK, and was having paid trips to Moscow. This is happening in all of our countries, and we need to highlight this, and we need to talk about this, and we need to call it out when it's happening. Anyway, so much for my 5-minute news piece today. It's 31 minutes long. Thanks so much for watching. I cut myself off earlier in trying to say my last bit to you, but if you're going to listen to anything today, this will be the most important thing I'm going to tell you all day. So one more thing to say.